All right. You've heard from us the background about the business and the strategy and where we're looking to go. The meat and drink of today, I know, there'll be pens, pencils, paper, everything ready to understand, well, what does this mean? What are we looking at for 2016 to 2020? And I'm going to be welcoming up Ashley Jagoe, who's the Area Manager for Delivery Management, looking after our northern region.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. I don't need to introduce myself. Mark's just done that on my behalf. But one of the reasons why I'm standing here is because I have recently had a role in helping collate the forward program for Sydney Water. So I've only recently moved into the new role. So I have some familiarity with the subject matter. That's the reason why I'm here. What I want to talk to you about really, and give you a high-level overview of what we're planning for the next 4 years in terms of our infrastructure capital program. And it's largely based on the interface we've had and interactions we've had with IPART in terms of our pricing determination, what constraints that provides us from a capital point of view, as well as what do we need to do in order to enhance that customer experience that we talked about earlier on. So I'm going to give you, as I say, a high-level overview of what we're doing, where we're planning to do it, and when. And you'll see a number of dates and things come up, and for most of those instances, those dates are not just the construction period, it's the planning period for a project all the way through to its delivery. So some of them look quite long, but that's part of the reason why. We've got designers here, we've got planners here, we've got constructors here, so I'm trying to address the needs of everybody in that regard. Okay. So let's start off with the budget. There's always a budget. Yeah? So this is the capital investment budget for Sydney Water across those 5 asset streams of water, wastewater, treatment, stormwater, growth, and Lower South Creek. For some of you, that Lower South Creek will be meaningful. For others of you, they'll go, what's that? Lower South Creek is a program where we're delivering 3 major upgrades to treatment plants. You'll hear a lot more about it later on in the morning, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much now. But we've highlighted it as a particular item in this budget because it actually is a significant amount of expenditure. As you can see, it's the yellow bars on the graph up there. I put in last year's capital budget as well, so you can see this year versus last year isn't going to change dramatically other than that Lower South Creek. But over the next 3 to 4 years, we're seeing a decline in that spend. And that's being driven largely by a reduction in growth. And I can see everybody going, well, hang on a minute, Sydney's growing at a hell of a rate. How can you have a reduction in your growth program? The driver for that isn't necessarily that we're going to be spending less money. The driver for it is that the certainty around where specific projects are going to take place is actually not that clear. At the moment, there's been stuff going on all over the place, and trying to get a coordinated plan, sequencing that growth has been really tricky. So we've highlighted a number of projects that we know we have to do in order to be able to meet current demand. We've got some in the program that we know are likely to be required, and there are some that could well be required that we currently haven't got funded, and we'll have to look at how we flex the program and or our funding in order to be able to address those. But rest assured, those of you in the development industry, it is not our intent to hamper growth. So if we need to find money to put in infrastructure to support growth, we will do so. So I just wanted to get that message loud and clear so that people aren't horrified by the picture that you see up there. So this is infrastructure delivered by all parties across Sydney Water, so delivery management, civil projects, and it also includes the developer-delivered works. So there's some works that we don't do, they do. This budget is all of that. So it's about $2.2 billion over the next 4 years. I think I've covered everything else. Let me move. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of how we're going to spend that? A bit more granularity. Gary talked about providing reliable services to our customers. A fairly sizable chunk of the money that we spend is actually just keeping going the assets that we already have. So these are reticulation renewals, critical water main renewals, upgrading of sewers or whatever. There are an awful lot of very small jobs that account for about $80 odd million a year. And that's excluding, these are ones delivered by delivery management. It excludes the stuff we do in civil projects and the capitalization of some main breaks. So if you add those back in there again, we're talking roughly about $100 million a year. It's about 20% of the capital budget next year will be just doing this like-for-like replacement. And the way in which, where we do this depends solely on inspections, condition assessments, failures. So we can't pinpoint exactly where that work's going to be right now. We know where some of it's going to be. But broadly, in terms of the regions that we have there, broadly it's about a 35 to 40% in the north, similar amount in the south, and the rest is in the west, in very rough numbers. That's not going to change. We've got 50,000 kilometers of pipe. We need to keep that pipe working and effective, and so the program doesn't change over the 4 or 5 years. In terms of the regions, there are different drivers for the work in each of these 3 regions, and what I wanted to do now is just give you a little bit of an explanation of how they're going to vary, and then I'll also talk about some of the key projects or the major projects that we're doing in each of those regions over the next 3 to 4 years. You'll notice, those of you who are mathematicians, that the forward program dollars actually, if you add them all up, will exceed the budget dollars. And that's where I address this issue around growth and the fact that there are growth projects in there. The timing of those, we might flex according to when the developer decides to put in DAs or even starts to build, and we know that there are going to be customers using those assets. We are not in the game of putting assets in the ground and then twiddling our thumbs and waiting for customers to connect. We're trying to do this in time type development and infrastructure upgrade. Otherwise, we're putting money into the ground and it's just sitting there doing nothing. Okay. So this is the picture for the north. As you can see, there's quite a spike over the next couple of years, and that's driven largely by the lower South Creek, which I mentioned earlier on. It's the upgrade of 3 major plants, essentially the amplification of Riverston treatment plant from about 4 megalitres a day to 14.2 megalitres a day. So almost a new plant, and significant upgrade of Quakers Hill and St Mary's plants. So that drives up that whole treatment profile there. There's also other treatment work going on in the area, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail afterwards. But that's the key driver there. I've tried to give you some idea there also around what that means in terms of type of work. So treatment work, obviously there's a fair amount of mechanical and electrical. There's some civil works there as well. And the profile there on those sort of red-colored bar charts is really about trying to give you, the industry, some insight as to where we think those sorts of types of capability are going to be required going forward. Again, the mathematicians will notice that the bottom doesn't add up to the top, and that's because we've taken out things like project management costs and design and all those other bits and pieces. So this is really about the construction component, not about all of the other support services, which we can't do the construction component without, let's be honest, but it's just about trying to make it a bit clearer for you. Okay. In the south is largely dominated by renewals type programs. There's a little bit of growth down in the Illawarra, but the southern region is essentially the CBD area out to as far as about Bankstown and everything south of that. There's not a lot of growth in those areas there other than infill growth projects, but there is a lot of renewal type work, and again there's some critical projects we're doing in and around the CBD to support both infill growth and renewal programs, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. So as you can see there, those renewals things are a lot more around repairing pipes and pumping stations. So there's a lot more sort of civil type work rather than actually true mechanical or electrical. There's not a huge amount of work at the treatment plants, with 1 or 2 exceptions, which I'll talk about later. And in the west, the driver in the west is growth. So the southwest growth area, so everywhere from sort of Austral, Leppington, which is to the west of Liverpool, all the way down to Wilton, down in Wallandilly. There are growth projects throughout that area, and that's what's the real driver of our work in those areas. So a lot of civil works there. We're putting in new mains, sub-mains, carriers, and a few pumping stations, that kind of thing. Okay, let's talk about some specifics, shall we? So some of the key projects in the north. What I want to do in this section is really just highlight some of the major projects over the next 4 years that we're either in planning right now. In some cases, we're quite some way down that planning avenue, but we may not necessarily have let contracts yet. In others, these are projects that haven't yet started and will be starting over the next 4-year period. The first one that I want to talk about is at North Head Biosolids Amplification. We probably need to increase the capacity there by something between 30 and 40%. The driver being additional volume coming through that plant from growth in the Northwest Growth Centre. It's serviced by a sewer system called the SWOOS, which starts in Blacktown, and so some of the growth is coming down the SWOOS. And there's also growth, infill growth happening in parts of that area around Ryde and so on, that feed into it. We also have a significant issue with retention times for biosolids there. And so the product quality coming out of those digesters right now is actually not very good. And we've had customer issues with rather odorous trucks driving through Manly as we shift that stuff out of there. So part of this is actually trying to reduce that impact and increase the time that for the biosolids to break down properly. This project is currently in planning. We'll actually let it next year, early next year is when we actually hope to start doing construction. So we're in the optioneering phase at this particular point in time. Lower South Creek, so I've mentioned it a couple of times, and you'll hear a bit more about this from Jeff later on. The Lower South Creek, as I said, is essentially a major upgrade. It's about a $300 million plus program of works on Quakers Hill, Riverston, and St Mary's. Part of the driver for putting these three together was the proximity of these three plants. But we also want to look at operational synergy between these plants. So what we've tended to do in the past is have plants as little islands. What we're trying to do here is to say, well, actually, we can move, in the case of Quakers to St Mary's, we can move biosolid or sludge from one to the other and handle all the sludge and the biosolids at one location rather than at two. We're also looking at trying to streamline operating protocols, streamline the type of kits that we use. So we've got commonality of equipment at various plants, which obviously have a better impact in terms of operational costs and maintenance costs going forward. It also, by bringing these three things together, allowed us or enabled us to look at a different way of approaching the marketplace. And we did that. We went out to the marketplace very early this year or late last year, sought tenders for a delivery partner model. That delivery partner is now on board. And as I said, Jeff is the representative of that delivery partner, and he'll be talking a little bit about the procurement process going forward, how you guys might be engaged with that. Okay. The SWOOS, this is as I said, major sewer that runs from Blacktown to North Head. It was built back in the late 20s, early 30s, brick line sewer in some places. It's suffered the ravages of time, I suppose, and as a consequence, we're doing a major program of works to rehabilitate that particular asset. This has been broken down into a number of projects, so I've put the sum here that's a sort of program sum, but actually the way we're managing it is in small chunks. We're doing a whole series of inspections of those sewers, determining what's the best way of dealing with the rehabilitation. And we're also having to desilt these things so that we can improve the flows. There's a lot of buildup of material in there that now needs to come out so that the capacity that's in that system can actually be fully utilized, and it's not at the moment. So I'm saying about 100 million over the next 4 years. It's probably more and over a longer period of time, if I'm honest. But this is the sort of ballpark that we're working to at this point in time. And then there are growth projects. Excuse me. Growth projects. So the Northwest Growth Centre, we've got package of work that's just about to be let to a contractor for what we're calling package 3B in the Northwest Growth Centre. And there's 2 more packages of work. Most of this work is building on infrastructure that we've already put in place. So we put in some carriers and mains and pumping stations. This is really packages of work that are putting in sub-mains, lead-ins, and those sorts of things that are augmenting the existing principal infrastructure that we put in there. They're very disparate projects. It's not located in one place. They're kind of bits of work all over the place to support the various areas of development that are going on out in the Northwest Growth Centre. Following on from that, we'll have package 4, starting up in around 2019, basically more of the same. And the timing for all of that, the timing of how we will do that, is really dependent on how quickly development occurs out there. And certainly things like the Northwest Rail Link have made a big difference to the timing around some of those precincts, and that's part of where some of our planning is still a little fluid, because what was originally planned is being changed because the marketplace is changing. The other area is Ingleside, up in the North Shore, or Pittwater area. So that's an area that's been designated a growth area. At the moment, there's very little happening. We're just starting the planning there for development works up in Ingleside. So in terms of shoveling ground, we're probably still 18 months away from that, but we're starting the work right now. Okay. Clicker's not working. Can you, oops, gone backwards too far now. Can you go back one, please? Number 7. Marsden Park and Marsden Park Industrial, these are also in the Northwest Growth Centre. The reason I've separated them out is that originally these were going to be delivered by developers under what's called a PAP, which is a Precinct Acceleration Programme. So essentially, where there was development required by developers outside the government programmed sequence of growth, developers were allowed, permitted, whatever the word is, to build that infrastructure, design and build that infrastructure to service their needs at their cost. And then Sydney Water would take it over once customers were actually connected to that system. There are 5 PAPs currently in this Marsden Park and Marsden Park industrial area and around it. So you've got 5 developers who are interested in doing whose only interest really is focused on the area that their development exists, and they're kind of starting to overlap a little bit, and there are some gaps as well. So what we've done is to say, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't make sense. We'll take back the planning of that. So Sydney Water is now going to do the planning for all of that growth. How we will deliver it and how it will be funded is still open to debate, I guess. We haven't landed on that. So whether Sydney Water will deliver it, or whether we'll still work with the development industry to do that remains to be seen. So that's why it's a bit of an oddball one there. It's not in our budget at the moment, but we'll have to deal with that as and when those decisions are made around how we're going to fund it. Okay. Key projects in the south. So as I said, most of these are around renewals, with the exception of this one. So this is a kind of mini green square. So those again are familiar with the Green Square project, where we're currently putting in a trunk drainage system to enable the development that's going on at the Green Square town centre. Ashmore Precinct is just to the west of that. It's an area that's been slated for further development around the Everleigh-Erskineville rail corridor. We're working again in conjunction with the City of Sydney Council on this one to remove the risk of flood. It's a flood-prone area that will then provide a platform, I suppose, or enabler for future development in that space. The planning for that has started now. It's still very early days, but the aim would be to sort of start looking to take that to the marketplace and do the more detailed planning early next year. The Southwest Ocean Outfall sewer. So this is a similar sort of story to the SWOOS in the north. don't think the condition is quite as poor as the SWOOS, but there's a recognition, we recognise that we're going to have to do some rehabilitation work in that at the moment. We haven't kicked off any work in this space yet. The plan is to start doing some of the inspections next year and to then determine the scopes of work that and the planning for the work that we would need to do on that particular asset. So the SWOOS runs from kind of Liverpool area to our plant at Malabar. So it's the kind of mirror image of what we're doing in the northern region. But it's a little bit behind in terms of the timing. Similar sorts of issues. Woolloomooloo, this is a project that we've been in planning for about 12 months or so now. The complexity around this one really is about working in the CBD. Mark already mentioned earlier on that what we do in the CBD and how we do work in the CBD is very different from how we do work in other places. So we're in some of those narrow streets in Darlinghurst and that part of the world, digging up roads to separate sewer and stormwater drains. So from a community impact point of view, while we're there doing this work, it's going to be a bit of a logistical nightmare, to be honest, in terms of how we do that work and keep noise down, keep dust down, and how we interact with traffic, because the roads around there are pretty narrow, as I already said. So it'll be an interesting project. We'll be letting that in the not too distant future. And again, there'll be sort of packages of work. It could be all under one contract, but we'll be doing packages of work, bits and pieces, because it covers quite a large area. Although I've put this in the south, actually it's a project that affects the south and the west to some extent. We've got a program of works now that we're in the, I suppose, latter stages of planning around upgrading dewatering facilities at a number of plants. So 2 of them are in the south at Shellharbour and Wollongong. We've got 2 in the west at Liverpool and Glenfield, which will require fairly significant money spent on them, about $20 million each, give or take. That work will be starting to look at letting next year, but we're currently in the sort of planning stage at the moment and working through what's the best procurement process for this piece of work. Do we do it all as one? Do we split it? How do we do that? So we're looking at that at the moment. So those of you who are interested in that, this is imminent. But they're all pretty small projects in the south. There aren't any really, really big projects in the south. And the west is dominated really by, as I said earlier on, by growth-related projects. And I've thrown a few of them up here, and you can read those for yourself. Nearly all of them are around putting pipes and pumps in the ground to service those new growth. The one exception there is upgrade to West Camden treatment plant, which we'll need to do in order to be able to handle additional flows through that plant once some of the work that's currently going on in that part of the world is completed. The timing, as I said, of these could vary. It really depends on what's going to drive those growth activities. That's not down to us, that's down to the marketplace and developers and demand for housing in those areas, I guess. And the willingness for people to want to go and live in those places. There's another small plant, it's an upgrade to St Mary's. This will probably actually get folded into the Lower South Creek project. It was a standalone piece on its own, but we'll probably manage it under that whole auspices. So I just thought I'd throw it in there anyway to show that there is some work happening on a treatment plant in the west, as well as the 2 at Liverpool and Glenfield. The last thing I want to touch on is Prospect Water Filtration Plant. So that plant is a BOO operation run by SWOOS, but they have asked us to work with them on planning of a significant major upgrade of that particular plant. And the reason for that upgrade is really to ensure that we can maintain the standard of product to meet the Australian drinking water standards going forward. There are increased demand out of Prospect as infill growth has occurred. And I suppose the quality of the receiving waters is also variable. So the water that comes out of Warragamba Dam or through from Nepean, the upper channel, is variable, and we want to ensure that that plant going forward is going to be able to manage and cater for all of that. So we're working with SWOOS at the moment on some early stage planning and prototyping of some options around improving that filtration system. The idea will be then to, once we've got through that phase, is to go to market for whatever the recommended upgrades actually are in terms of detail. How that will be funded, who will be funding it, and so on, is still under discussion. So whether, because it's a BOO, does SWOOS fund it and then we pay back over years, or do we fund some of it up front or whatever? So those sorts of discussions are actually going on right now. But from your point of view, it's a piece of work that's coming down the pipeline, so you don't need to worry too much about where the money's coming from. Okay, so I've covered everything I wanted to. There was one project that I didn't mention that was in the north, and the reason I didn't mention it, it's only really just come to light, and that's Rouse Hill Treatment Plant. We're also looking, and Castle Hill Treatment Plant. We're also looking at upgrading those two plants to accommodate growth. That growth has been driven at a faster rate than we had originally anticipated, again, because of that rail corridor that's been put in there. So the demands on those plants has increased at a far greater rate than we had anticipated. So we're going to have to start putting some money and investing into how we're going to manage that. How that ties in with what we're doing with Lower South Creek remains to be seen. Whether we keep them separate, whether we manage them, don't know yet. It's very early days. But again, heads up, we've got a fairly significant investment to make at Rouse Hill over the next few years. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover off in terms of, sorry, I'll go back one, the key projects. I'm happy to chat with anybody outside afterwards about any of the detail or anything that you expected to see that you didn't see. But I'll now hand over to Paul Maslin, who's our Capital Procurement Manager, and he'll talk about how we will want to work with you guys going forward. Thank you.